Officially, welcome to the Gateway Spotlight. This is a show designed to highlight diverse perspectives, next generation initiatives, and emerging trends in the world of international higher education. I'm your host, Brooke Roberts. I've been in international higher education my entire career, so about 20 years. And I'm the founder of Inside Study Abroad, and I'm currently the vice president of marketing for VIA TRM, which is the leading modern software solution powering university global operations. So let's talk about our topic today. But briefly, I have Clare Overmann and Mark Overmann here, and I'm going to introduce them more fully in a second. But today we're going to talk about how their personal and professional journeys have intertwined, what their work has been like on the front lines of global education, specifically in the last few days. And we're also going to try to talk about what's next for our field in these somewhat turbulent, uncertain times, and some hope and goals for the future on how we can address this as a community. On a personal note, if you've been to these spotlights in the past, you've probably noticed I try to be positive and bring some levity to our conversations because I think our work is important and it can be fun. But I'm not sure if any of you are feeling this, but I am struggling to find some positives. I keep waffling between pure anger and sadness and depression maybe. So if you are feeling something similar, I just want you to know you're not alone, and it's okay to not have to wrap everything up in a silver lining, if you will. So if I seem less chipper than I have in the past, that's probably why. And moving forward, let's get this party started. I am so excited to introduce our incredible panelists. They not only bring unparalleled expertise in the world of international education, but they also embody the heart and soul of what this field represents. They are a true global connection, both personally and professionally. So we have Clare Overmann, CEO of AIEA, where she drives the vision and growth of this leading organization for global education leadership. Previously, Clare held senior roles at IIE, Institute for International Education, and she managed major government-funded programs and corporate partnerships. We also have Mark Overmann. He's the executive director of the Alliance for International Exchange, and he has 20 years of experience across NGOs, universities, and government. And he's been a steadfast advocate for global collaborations, including leadership roles at Accenture Federal Services and Georgetown University. But here's a little twist about their story. Clare and Mark are not just colleagues in the field, they are also married. That's right. What started as a shared passion for our field blossomed to a real-life IE love story. So today they stand before us as a true global learning powerhouse. So I'm very excited to talk a little bit about that and bring some smiles to everybody's faces as it relates to that. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Brooke.
Thanks, Brooke.
So let's start, before we get into the heavier things, can you, Clare, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about your international education story. Like, how did you find your way into this really interesting niche field of ours? And Mark, I'll have you go as well. And then we'll talk about how your worlds came together.
Oh my gosh. Well, like so many people in our field, I got into it through language and love of language. Almost in as early as 6th grade, I was like really into Spanish, loved the language, loved this idea of language leading into intercultural experiences too. Made a beeline for study abroad when I got to college, worked abroad in Europe after college even. And then one day was Googling like the terms international and education, and I found out that it was actually something you could study and get a master's degree in. And so I did my master's in international ed at NYU, which led me to a practical experience at IIE, where I just ended up staying for 13 more years, and am now in this new wonderful opportunity with AIEA.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and for me, again, very similar to so many of us, I had the opportunity to study abroad, which I did in France my junior year of college, and then to teach English in northeastern China for a year after college, which were my two foundational international experiences. Growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, we never really left the country, so it wasn't until that opportunity in college that I had that just opened my world. And funny, slightly differently than Clare, who is an incredible linguist and I studied French throughout high school and beginning of college, and I was just okay at it. But when it came time to study abroad, I thought, actually, I'm done with French. I don't want to do this anymore. I went to the University of Notre Dame. Where would you go when you go to Notre Dame but Dublin? But everybody else had that idea. So I actually got waitlisted for the Dublin program. And somehow the study abroad office talked me into going from a semester in Dublin to a year in France. So all you study abroad advisors out there, well done, because you got me to go from what I thought I wanted to do to actually what I really needed to do, which was to go for a whole year immersed in a different language. And I'm so, so glad I did, because that really just changed my life and led me to this field. And kind of like Claire, when I was trying to figure out what do I do after graduation, after this cool experience I had in China, I found, oh, you can get a master's. And in my case, it was international communication at American University. And it was through being in DC there that I was able to meet a bunch of people, get some internships, and actually find our field, which I'm so, so glad that I did.
I feel like we need to take that clip of you talking about switching your program and the
Yeah.
city advisor. And we all need that like on our home pages for our study abroad offices.
It's
Like,
so funny.
watch
It's
this
kind of
first.
like when I think about that experience, it's like I blacked out a little bit. Like I went into the study abroad office with a goal and then came out having signed up for a year in France. Like, wait a minute, how did this happen?
That's awesome. Well, let's get into then the power couple thing we've got going on here. So obviously you guys are married, and we did a pre-interview last week, and I hadn't heard the story, which I thought was just lovely. So I did get their okay to ask about this personal subject. So it's not an aha or a gotcha moment. So yeah, tell me a little bit about how you all came into each other's worlds.
Well, we have NASA to thank for that, I have to say. I think we were, I think we counted back to 2015, no, even earlier,
2013.
2013, NASA in St. Louis, just kind of meeting each other for the first time, kind of running in some similar circles. And, shout out to our good friend at the State Department, Jared Butow, who was like a key part in connecting us in that way. And then I think a couple years later, when it was in Boston, NASA Boston, I think people were trying to get back together and just get that same group again. And I think the term like, let's get the band back together again was even thrown around. And so I think that's kind of where we re-met, and, just kind of all the love and passion surrounding international education, which we all know and can feel, especially at a place like NAFSA, I think really got the best of us. But Mark, I don't know what your experience was during this time.
It's totally different than what you just said. No, Claire likes to make fun of me a little bit because at that NAFSA in Boston, the first night I was there, I attended an IIE reception, and Claire was a greeter at the door. And I walked in and saw her and said, "Hey, I'm Mark. Do you remember me?" And I didn't want to presume anything that, we didn't know each other too well at that time. And she's likes to rib me that, like, well, of course I remembered you. And so, which was really nice to hear.
And it was also the beginning, like the earliest days of Uber, actually. And I remember we shared one to go like have drinks at some point after the reception, and then had traded numbers. And then I had kind of coyly texted him later, like, hey, I owe you an Uber or something like that. So love and
love that.
And we've been married for a number of years now and have an amazing 2.5-year-old son.
That's awesome. I was gonna ask like who made the first move, but I'm giving it to Claire
I think,
with the text.
yeah, you can get to Claire with the text.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing that a little bit about your story, how you guys came together personally. And I'd really love that you have this both dynamic of being professional colleagues, but also obviously also life partners. And I jokingly asked you last week, like, what are your conversations at dinner? Like, do you say no IE talk ever? Like, let's shut it down, or are you just like going hard into it? And you both said no.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Oh, we sure do. Yeah.
Oh, it's impossible to shut it all down as much as we might like to sometimes.
Yeah.
I think it's always been such a strong piece of our relationship is, like you said, we both love the work we do, this field, all the people we work with. And so it's actually not a chore to talk about it together after work, before work, on the weekends. And I think we learn a lot from each other, which is really, really fun. Claire's work at IIE, my work at the Alliance and other places has always been very closely related, but parallel. So we actually have learned a lot about different parts of the field from our various work, which is really fun. But now, of course, running associations that are often very similar in kind of shape and form, and we share a lot of really interesting kind of perspective about just running an association and what that means and how we do that, which I think has been really, really great to be able to kind of share lessons learned just about not just the content and the topics, but like how do you approach these things? How do you manage a board? How do you manage a budget? All those kind
Mm,
of things. So that's been
yeah.
really great.
Well, that's a great segue. I was going to ask you both to kind of give me just a brief 30-second elevator kind of explanation of what your organizations are, what they do in the international education arena, and then we're going to dive into some other meaty stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, AIEA, Association of International Education Administrators, is a 40-year-old organization, and it is the Association for International Education Leadership. It has kind of historically been primarily composed of the senior most international officers at higher education institutions. But of course, our membership includes international education leaders from across organizations and entities as well as around the world.
And the Alliance for International Exchange, similarly as an association, we're in our 32nd year. But we're in the kind of parallel realm of our field where we are representing 92 organizations, all US-based organizations that run international exchange programs of all kinds. So we're kind of the complementary body to the higher ed world. All of our organizations are nonprofits, NGOs, for-profits, runs the gamut. But the main common denominator is that they're running Department of State exchange programs of all different kinds. But we also, of course, represent the higher ed world as well in international education via members like AIEA, NAFSA, AIRC, and many others. So technically, Claire is a member of mine, and I joke both sort of joking she could be on my board, which would be an interesting dynamic if that ever came to pass.
Conflict of
But
interest.
with the Alliance, our main role is we are a policy body, an advocacy body. We work to represent our members' interests on Capitol Hill with the State Department, and advocacy is really the world we work in. That is how we spend most of our time.
Great. Awesome. Okay. Thank you for setting the stage for us about your backgrounds, expertise, what your organizations do. So let's dive in. So we're going to get into specifics after this question, but I want to talk more generally about, well, let me frame this. As many of you probably know, there's been a flurry of executive orders that have been handed down since Donald Trump took office on Monday. And a lot of it is what he ran on, like what he said he was going to do. I think the speed at which is a little surprising, but we kind of knew what was coming. So I want to talk a little bit generally about this broad sweeping sort of, I think there were like 70 some executive orders and pardons and things like that. But what do you think this is going to have? Do you think this has any effect, what's happened so far on international education specifically? Mark, I'm going to pass that to you.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's a lot has happened already in the first couple days, and it's a lot of information to digest for all of us. I think my first comment on that would be of everything that has come out, executive orders and otherwise this week. So far, we have not seen anything that is directly mentioning international education, international exchange, State Department exchange programs, etc. So nothing specifically targeting our field in that way. That's not to say that still might not happen. We're certainly concerned about that, given that things like that did happen in the first administration, the first Trump administration. But for the moment, it's really, I think, seeing that among all these executive orders, there are a lot of pieces of those, most of them more broadly. I think they're more broadly focused, but there's a lot of pieces within a number of these executive orders that are causing concern that could be really potentially challenging for our field. And I know we can get into more of those details, but I think that's kind of the broad way to look at it, is like there's nothing that's specifically targeting us right now or yet. And there's a lot that's potentially challenging and to be concerned about.
Thoughts, Claire?
No, I'll just say that I think that it's pre-inauguration. I think we were all in a kind of a wait and see mode. And I think we are actually still in this wait and see mode of, and we're so fortunate to have these organizations who are kind of eagle-eyed looking at all of these executive orders, new kind of proposed regulations coming out, like the Alliance, like NAFSA, like the President's Alliance, who are kind of looking at these so hawkishly and kind of trying to pick them apart for us so that we can kind of be doing our preparatory work kind of and be ready if and when something does happen.
Well, let's start talking about some of these specifics and get some dialogue going around these. You know, as we said, we're trying to frame this in international education, but to Mark's point, you know, if it hasn't explicitly said international ed, but we can kind of surmise maybe what could happen moving forward. One of the biggest things, and I think one of the things we all can very much remember, is the original travel ban in 2017, and targeting primarily Muslim countries, and the chaos that ensued because of that. And I know that there was an executive order related to that with very interesting language that could possibly lead us towards another travel ban. Talk to me a little bit about how do you think this might spill over into the international ed space, and maybe similarly to before or differently? Claire, I'll pass this one to you specifically.
I'm going to give it to Mark, and then and then I want to talk about kind of the reaction from especially the higher ed community.
Yeah, no, that I think would be helpful. Yeah, Brooke, the one you're I think referring to is there was an executive order related to terrorism, basically, that, among other things, calls for the suspension of admission of nationals from certain countries where, quote, vetting and screening information is deficient, as well as an evaluation of all visa programs to ensure they aren't being used by, quote, hostile actors. So this is one that is broadly concerning just in terms of, well, what does deficient mean? What visa programs are we talking about? What is this evaluation going to look like? But I think it was widely seen that this executive order was one that could be setting things up for new travel bans or restrictions, similar to what you were mentioning, Brooke, the quote Muslim travel ban, the quote China initiative from the previous administration, which is, of course, at the top of our list that we've been anticipating and worrying about that something like that could come. So while it seems like the initial executive orders did not include okay, here's a travel ban, there does seem to be the setting up for the potential of that. And yeah, so Claire, maybe you can talk about.
Well, I just wanted to add just more of like that we have seen this before, and we know what the reactions were like last time, and we don't exactly know what's going to happen, but we do know how we can prepare for it. And that is, kind of across higher education institutions in our country, certainly kind of reaffirming their own values about kind of who they want to have on their campus, how they want to interact with the greatest diversity of international students and students in general. As well as kind of the practical of sending specific messages that are both informative and reassuring, trying to kind of work with their kind of across the institution, including with government affairs, to make sure that the kind of any implications for the institution are clear and are communicated to the right audiences. So this is not a solution, but it's just to say that every single higher education institution is thinking about how they need to act and react to these things.
Right. Yeah. And to add to that, of course, I guess, obvious that any countries that indeed are part of a ban, well, institutions not being able to bring students from those countries is obviously incredibly problematic and challenging.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads me to kind of another conversation, just broadly kind of about the perception of the international student community, both, who are shopping for their higher education experience and looking to go abroad, but also the students who are already maybe enrolled and coming home or coming back to the United States from being home and things like that. I feel like it's really interesting, the immigration related executive orders that have come down about, the mass deportation. and sort of the widespread nature of it, especially going into places that were typically considered sanction areas, being schools, places of worship, things like that. And I think that what comes to mind for me is the idea of ICE or maybe the military coming onto a university campus and, demanding papers be shown. Obviously, that would be the worst, most scary situation. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how students might be perceiving all these broader stroke immigration things, and even if it's not specifically targeting their visa type, how that might impact how they're thinking about a future in a U.S. higher education system.
Well, of course it is affecting them. It's kind of like any good consumer looking at a potential product and saying, is this something that I want to buy? Is this something that I want to invest in? The same way that we know that some students from abroad are concerned about violence on campuses, for instance, this is a similar kind of negative message, of course, that is going to affect the marketing and value proposition of a U.S. higher education for sure. I think some of the things that kind of I would love to see happen is just kind of the decoupling, though, and the clarification of how we're talking about international education and exchange, and really that cultural exchange component and immigration, and trying to kind of make sure that it's clear who this is pertaining to. And of course, we all feel for kind of DACA students and people who are truly affected by these immigration measures, but being very clear to international students about whether they are or not part of that too.
And I think that's a really great point about decoupling our work from, quote, immigration, that just from a political level has been a part of our strategy for a long time. Basically to say, whether it's to the Hill or otherwise, what we are doing is not immigration and should not be thought of in that way. We are quite literally non-immigrant visa categories in which all of our programs are functioning in. These are temporary stays. They could be 3 months, they could be 3 years or more, but it is temporary. And yes, we want some international students and others to actually stay here for all the reasons many of us understand in terms of the talent that they can bring to our country. But fundamentally, this is not immigration. This is international education and exchange. And I guess I could say some people buy that argument, some people don't, but it is true. And it is something that is important for our work, that when we are trying to talk about what it is we do, and that decoupling idea is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what that makes me think about is how we communicate those types of messages, because I think if we've learned anything from the past year of an election, is that nuance and details and gray areas are not great headlines. You're not going to see a headline that says, visa holders at institutions are not immigrants. They're never going to have something that overt, and where people will be like, oh, they don't care about the difference. They just see that it's a different person. So I think that's like kind of where I land on it, is just how can we as professionals make sure that we articulating the nuance, the gray area, the footnotes, if you will, in a way that will be heard by the people who tend to kind of ignore some of those things. And I know you do this all the time, Mark. Go ahead, Claire.
No, I was going to say, I think this actually like leads really nicely into, I think, so many of our collective strategies, especially kind of led by the Alliance work of trying to, and we've been trying to do this for a long time now, this isn't anything really new, but trying to kind of retranslate, reframe what we do in a language that is going to be heard and understood and possibly even appreciated by this administration, but even beyond this administration, just appreciated by a broader diversity of people who we want to care about international education. And so, Alliance came up with some really good kind of reframing language. I know kind of, all of the big organizations have done this. And I think the more that we can give this as resources to our our colleagues to speak to their, I was speaking from the higher education perspective, speak to their institutional leadership, speak to their boards of trustees, speaks to their government affairs officials, whoever it may be, to have all these different types of language ready at hand so that the broadest amount of people can understand what we do in the way that they need to understand it.
Yeah.
Is that, Mark, just real quick, is that sort of cheat sheet, what I'm going to call it, is that publicly available?
It is.
Okay,
It is.
great. Great.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to. I could probably get those links quickly and put them in the chat. But yeah, Claire's referencing. I think, well, two things that I could share. One is a messaging campaign that we had started in the fall prior to the election. The whole purpose of which was to basically define our programs very clearly in a way as to how they benefit the U.S. And we did that in a way that we felt we could take it in a direction no matter who won the election. But I think very specifically it was much more important if Trump won the election to be able to, specifically articulate how international education and exchanges are an investment in the US. And that doesn't preclude all the other benefits that come with what we do or preclude why many of us do what we do. But it's, as Claire said, just emphasizing the points in the language that are going to resonate best with the audience you're trying to convince. And that, I think, is in many ways just advocacy 101. And
Right.
that's important. And I think that really relates to, from at least a Capitol Hill perspective of, yeah, you're right, the nuance can be really hard to get across to people. It can also be really hard to try to convince people to believe what you believe if they're not inclined to do that. And kind of at a fundamental level, okay, that's okay. People have different points of view and different things that they're focused on. But ultimately, when you're able to show X member of Congress, here's the constituent interest and impact, here's the dollars and cents, and here is what you lose if this goes away, that's when you get people's attention. And that has nothing to do with administration or political moment in time. That is just something that has always been the case. But I think it's especially important right now because, just as, to put it in perspective, we could spend a lot of time trying to convince X member of Congress to support international engagement. Like, this should be in your bones. Or we could just get right to the heart of it and say, this is why it matters to your constituents and why, if you support this, they'll vote for you. And if it goes away, they're going to be really pissed about it.
Yeah.
That's the more efficient and ultimately more effective way to get at it.
Yeah. Claire, did you have, were you going to
No,
say something? Okay.
Mark is truly the expert on this.
Yeah. Well, no, I just think too, it's like sometimes I think, I'm just going to say it, we as international educators kind of have to step off our high horse and speak in, like to your point, speak into the language that is going to be heard by somebody. Of course, we want to talk about the academics and the psychosocial development and, all these great things that are true still, but getting to the brass tacks of, that's all great too, but like, here's the brownie. Yeah, here's the
Well,
brownie.
we should talk about those things.
Yes.
We should emphasize those things
Right.
to the right audiences at the right moment.
Right. Exactly.
Absolutely. Because all of these things can be true and are true. It's just a matter of what are you saying to whom at the right moment to achieve your goal. I think I've found my links that I'm going to pop into the chat.
Great.
One is one pager on our messaging campaign that is literally called International Exchange, a Proven Investment, that is focusing in just the ways we talked about. And then the other one is a policy recommendations paper that we put out in November aimed at the new administration that reiterates some of these talking points, as well as just puts forward what we as the Alliance and our broad-based membership think is important that people might find useful as to not only what we're going to be focusing on, but how we're trying to frame the language.
Yeah. Well, since we're on the advocacy conversation, I think these types of resources, super helpful. The messaging that we're creating around how we talk to powers that be about what we do. But beyond that, what are some advocacy strategies if somebody's like really like fired up and they want to be part of the solution beyond just their day-to-day work? What are some other suggestions or strategies that you have for people that they can feel like they're adding to the solution?
Mark, you take it first.
I'll take it first. Yeah. To repeat a little bit of what I was just saying, one is local advocacy. And by that, I mean, of course, the Alliance is based in DC. Claire and I are based in DC. So much of our work is engaging with members of Congress in their DC offices. But ultimately, what they care about and what they listen to is the constituent voices and that very local impact, and I think especially economic impact. And so it's in the case of many on the call, the institutions, you yourselves are those major drivers of not just education, but also jobs and local economic investment in your communities. Showing that is so crucially important. Engaging with your members of Congress's offices in your communities, in district offices for House representatives and state offices for senators is so great. And that's something we try to encourage and do ourselves. But of course, we can only get to so many places. The focus has to be that. That is how we bring people to our cause. When you say, without international students coming to our university, we lose X. We gain Y for this. It allows American students to do these sorts of things. What are those specific benefits? And like I said, I think we have to take it the next step further of, if this goes away, here's what we stand to lose. And that's not what you want to lose, right, member of Congress?
Yeah.
And I think in doing that, of course, it's like I was saying, the messaging that focuses on how what we do promotes the U.S. is an investment in America. One of the good pieces we haven't talked about, I think, of the new administration is the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And we talked a little bit about this in our prep calls. He's somebody who in the Senate has been really supportive of international engagement, international exchange via his committee assignments and his work. He's actually somebody we've engaged with much over the years in a positive way. So when he was put forward as the nominee, our general reaction was like, oh yeah, that's pretty good. Especially maybe in comparison to some of the other nominees across the cabinet. This is really good. And he was just confirmed. And in his hearing, his confirmation hearing, he was saying every policy the State Department needs to pursue has to answer three simple questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Does it make America more prosperous? And from our perspective, we're like, not only is the answer yes, strong yes to all those questions when it comes to the programs we all run, it dovetailed directly with that messaging campaign we had been working on. So we're happy to see that. But I think this is a good example of, okay, here's a statement from the administration as to what matters to them when it comes to international and foreign policy. How do we make sure we are answering those questions no matter who we're talking to? So from an advocacy perspective, it's really making sure your messaging is like speaking to, as we've been talking about, the audience you want to convince. And here's a blueprint that they're giving us as to how we might do that. So those are just a few of the ways we're thinking about advocacy. But then I think how institutions specifically are thinking about it, I mean, that's where Claire's expertise is.
Well, yeah, and I would just say, kind of overarching though, I think we're all very appreciative of these kind of bigger umbrella organizations like Alliance, NAFSA, and others who are playing the important role of coordinating amongst themselves so that we have a strong, unified voice. Because again, kind of going back to things getting lost in the nuance and the noise, if we have 1 million people going to their congressional representatives with 1 million different asks, with 1 million different perspectives, that's just not heard as well. So I think this is one positive thing about these kind of times that feel very challenging, is that people are extra pumped to work together. And there is a lot more coordination. We know what's on the line. We know what's at stake. So where we would have had potentially like loose partnerships, or maybe everybody going a little bit at their own, we are all trying to be as unified as possible. And so an organization like mine, which hasn't historically been as involved in advocacy, we have all these ways that we can already plug in. We have all these new resources that we can have kind of trickle down and cascade down to our members, who are all trying to kind of make the case in their institutions, with their local representatives, local government, et cetera. I would say too, just kind of when I think about what I would say to an institution trying to figure out how to start advocating, I'd almost start with like, arm yourself with data, with storytelling, with how all of this work affects the things that your university president cares about, let's say, rankings, kind of return on investment, graduation rates, kind of get your data right, kind of get all of the pieces together, so that when you are called up to kind of brief your government affairs representative or go on that trip to your local representative or your congressional representative, that you have all that information.
I think that's right. And I just add to Claire's point about the coalition aspect of our field, it's so right. Not only are individual associations, coalitions doing the great work that they've always been doing, but I think an example of the increased collaboration is the US for Success Coalition, which many on the call might be familiar with, but if you're not, it's definitely worth checking out. This is very much a organic kind of grassroots coalition of lots of organizations already working in the space, including the Alliance, NAFSA, the President's Alliance for Higher Ed and Immigration, IIE, WES, Shorelight, a whole bunch of organizations that last year came together and said, we need to do more. Regardless of what the election results are, we have to collaborate more. And that is just one great example of how this is happening across the field. And even just this week, that group, among lots of other groups, the information sharing, perspective sharing has just been phenomenal. I've learned so much from all of my colleague organizations and hopefully them from me, and in a way that I'm just so much more knowledgeable and feel more prepared because of them and because of our collaboration and constant communication than I would have before. So that for me is a real positive of how we've responded to challenges over the last, well, 8 years, and how we're in a much better position, I think, as a field to respond moving forward this year and beyond.
I was on a call with some folks from NAFSA right before this, and we were talking about the NAFSA Advocacy Day, which is coming up soon, and I believe registration is open. So if anyone's interested in getting involved with that, and going to DC and actually meeting with your representatives there on site to talk about these specific things. We also talked about how, communicating our message, like how can we do it in a way, that people will actually hear it. And I thought, it'd be so cool. And I'm going to challenge somebody on the call, maybe you're in grad school or, you just want to do something interesting, is go through the C-suite of all Fortune 500 companies and identify everybody who basically came to the United States as an international student at some phase. Because I'd be very interested. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a very low number, but I feel like there might be some interesting data that comes from that, just in terms of like, oh yeah, 50% of, executives across the US were international students. I just think something like that could be really
and I don't know what the data is, but
yeah,
some of our largest tech companies that immediately pop to your mind are all run by international students, and or F1, J1 visa holders of different kinds. So there you go.
Exactly, 100%. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about another executive order, and it kind of relates to what you were saying about Marco Rubio being becoming Secretary of State. How do you, I mean, I know what he said when you quoted him, that really aligned with the work and advocacy that you all have put forward. But what about this quote unquote America First kind of doctrine? And there was a specific executive order citing this, and it targets the Department of State specifically. I mean, how do you think that's going to balance with, an extreme, version of American First, but with the sort of core principles Rubio brings to the table?
It's a great question. You're right. This America First EO specifically directs the Department of State to bring, I'm going to quote it, all policies, programs, personnel, and operations in line with an America First foreign policy. Very kind of expected language and not particularly specific. So like so many of the nuggets throughout all these executive orders, how it shakes out will be, well, what do those things really mean? What does America First for foreign policy mean? I guess I would say if it means my interpretation of it, of international education and exchange absolutely supports our country and its various economic, diplomatic, and social aspects, well, then, yeah, it very much aligns with America First foreign policy. But I'm not naive enough to think that that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And this, I think, gets to, I don't have an answer to the question, of course, but it's the exact right question that we're thinking about and talking about. And when it comes to Secretary Rubio, the second thought I had, many of us had after saying, oh, yeah, that's a good pick for us, is how will his support of what we do in the Senate over the years translate to this new role, especially given we know he is going to be pushed in a certain direction by the administration, by the president. What is that going to look like? How much, quote, independence will he be able to have to pursue what he might think is right versus what he's kind of being forced to think is right, if that makes sense? So that's going to be the rub. And of course, he's going to get pushed in certain directions, but what those directions are or how far he gets pushed, that's what we're going to have to keep our eye on very closely.
And I think I'll just add that, like, again, yeah, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish about any of this, because I think there are going to be real challenges ahead. But, my background is in international partnerships. And, one of the core tenets there is kind of the concept of mutual benefit, the concept of things not being mutually exclusive when it comes to who benefits from anything. And so I do think that an America First is certainly can be congruent with international work, with all of the work that we do. And like we were talking about before, with kind of reframing the language, there are ways to talk about all of the work that we do and keep it kind of at its core value while still having benefit for Americans, of course. I think we've been making this argument for study abroad for ages now, of kind of how this makes our workforce more competitive, how international education and exchange in general makes all of our institutions and our graduates more competitive people in a global workforce.
Yeah. Well, we are coming close to time, and I want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to ask their own questions to our panelists. I'm going to kind of triage these a little bit. We may not get to everyone's questions here. A lot of anonymous submissions here. So I think it's very telling how, some people don't want to be on the record necessarily about this subject. So interesting. Here's one. Sorry, I'm just reading these for the first time. Sorry. Claire, there's one that somebody wants to know your vision for AIEA just generally, but here's one that's very specific, and I don't know much about this, and maybe Mark, and especially in your work, you've heard of it. But any potential for dual intent visas, such as study and potential immigration to going together? What's the chatter on that?
Yeah, great question. I guess the brief answer would be, of course, that as an issue and as an advocacy priority has been on our various minds, especially our colleagues at NAFSA. The U.S. for Success Coalition has been focused on that. I would say if the election had gone a different way, there would be more space to much more actively pursue that, simply because probably we'd be less in a defensive crouch and we'd be able to take more of a proactive stance there. I think that issue, as well as a number of other kind of issues related to international students and their ability to study and then work here, will be harder to pursue for just obvious reasons that we're going to have to be more defensive than perhaps offensive. But it is still definitely on everyone's radar as an important thing and something that we would, of course, want to pursue. I'm also going to kind of maybe defer to my colleagues at NAFSA. I think Rachel Banks is on the call and has put some stuff in the chat. They have lots of great information about that. That was an unsatisfying answer, I'm sure. It's on people's radars for sure, but it's going to be a challenging moment to try to push for new things like this.
Yeah. Well, and I want to bring up this question that the person kind of gets into more specifics about collaborations with China specifically, and how, your advice on how people should approach those if there's a third rail they shouldn't touch, and looking at specifically international partnerships with China. If any of you have some thoughts about that.
I'll speak to it briefly from a higher level and then give Claire time to figure out if she can say anything from an institutional perspective. I mean, I would say, one, the reality is that the political discussion around the U.S.-China relationship, especially on Capitol Hill, the political discussion is really challenging. There's this notion of conflict, and the phrase I always hear is countering China. How is the U.S. countering China? I always try to go with the talking point of our programs, what we do, welcoming Chinese students and scholars, exchange programs, trying to get Americans to study in China, which is at a terribly low level right now after actually being quite high. That is a part of our strategy for, quote, countering China. There has to be these key elements of collaboration that will allow us to better find the place where we can coexist. And that is a, quote, countering. Some people are with me on that argument, others aren't. But that's just kind of a reality of the political situation we're in. So I don't think it's a third rail by any means. I think it's obviously absolutely crucial that we are engaging China as a country and that we all are continuing the programs that we do to engage with Chinese students, scholars, have Americans studying Chinese language, et cetera, et cetera. But it is fraught, of course. Things like TikTok are all influencing the general discussion around that, even if it has nothing to do with what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's perhaps just approaching the topic more carefully than you might want to or have had to in the past, noting all of the kind of baggage that surrounds it. But for me, noting that it is still absolutely important and crucial that we are trying to push those programs, that we are trying to push our relationship with that country in positive ways for so many reasons. But of course, that Chinese students are such a huge portion of all of our international student population. That's so vitally important for lots of reasons. And we not only don't want to lose that, we want that to continue to grow.
And it's interesting. I mean, I think in U.S. higher ed institutions have long, for a while now, already been very sensitive and kind of up on their own internal policies and regulations related to complying with kind of any U.S. government concerns, especially related to intellectual property and export. And of course, there might be even more of a crackdown now, in which case, yes, we will have to probably concentrate more on the relationships related to, student exchange, faculty-led programs, perhaps shy away from a few of the more kind of research-related partnerships that we may have had previously. But by no means does it mean that exchange and kind of international partnerships with China, which is so critical and crucial, should ever cease to exist.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add too that is something we're very keenly thinking about is that actually China's investment in their own exchange programs and public diplomacy writ large is actually quite high, far more than the US spends on exchange programs or public diplomacy activities of a variety of different kinds. We want to push that idea in the sense of if you want to quote counter China, here is one way that they are outperforming us and outspending us in a very crucial realm to push their own story, their own educational aspects, their own culture, etc. We need to do more of that because we're being outdone there, and therein lies a potential opportunity to try to spur people to action, spur lawmakers to action, to actually invest more in what we're doing. Hopefully for lots of different reasons, but one of them could be, well, we're being outrun here, so let's catch up.
I wonder if the TikTok ban is kind of stayed or even reversed, like what that kind of will do to the whole tenor of this conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I think the short memory of, this actually came up in the first Trump administration of needing to ban TikTok as a threat to, the US, and now it's not. I mean, we could get into the inside baseball of all of that, but I want to actually address a question that came through, and I think it's really important that we address questions like this because I think it kind of has a counter perspective than maybe we've been addressing here. So this person says, this administration wants to renegotiate the post-World War II and post-Cold War order. In a way, the world is already doing that, especially with the BRIC countries. With this new approach from the administration, this might open up new opportunities that global programming and international ed across the country has not thought of at this time. In essence, how can we look at this moment as an opportunity and not an attack on our field?
It's a great question. I was reading that too before you were reading it, trying to noodle on that a little bit. I mean, I do think what I just said about the China spending and us trying to, counter that or catch up to that is maybe one small example of a different way of thinking about how we promote or how we try to get political support for what we do. I love that idea, though, that we should try to reframe how we're thinking. One of the other themes that our team at the Alliance came to early on after the election is, yes, we have to be very cognizant of the challenges that we're anticipating that are likely there, but also let's relentlessly seek common ground. And I really like that. That phrase is going to be something that I think drives us a lot, because if we are just assuming that it's nothing but challenges and nothing but defensive, then we are not going to be open to those potential ideas for a new way of doing things or a new ally that we're not anticipating. So I don't really know what those opportunities are that perhaps the questioner maybe has some in mind, but I do think it's such a crucial mindset that we put in place. And just for example, as we're engaging with new members of Congress, especially Republicans, those who are just taking office, having in mind this idea of who is this person, what do they care about, and how might they come to our cause or be interested in what we do from their perspective that might be something we hadn't thought of before, or a perspective that we hadn't considered, but that they might want to get involved and might drive us in an interesting and new direction and find support in another way. Again, I know a vague answer, but I think it's such a really good question that we have to push ourselves to have that more optimistic, positive, forward-moving kind of frame of mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Well, and I think it's, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll just briefly add that just I kind of, like I said before, I think sometimes when there are perceived challenges or certain kind of parameters or a box that you've been feel like you're being put in, it actually can sometimes spur the innovations and creativity that you look back on, you know, in a positive light. You know, we think about even certain things from the first Trump administration, things from the pandemic, ways that we've changed our entire way of looking at things based on really challenging periods. And so I think it does behoove us all to think about what are the new strategies, the opportunities, the you know, if we think about global engagement, you know, should we invest more in kind of our ASEAN relationships? Are there new players out there that we could strengthen relationships with now? Are there creative ways to keep the work that we feel so strongly about going, like work with refugees that can be kind of intra-regional, that can be in partnership with our sister institutions and organizations around the world? This is when those kind of key tenets of good partnerships really come into play.
Yeah, that's a great great way to almost end. And I want to kind of end with kind of related to one of the questions that was submitted, because I do want to end on a high note. I think before we started talking, we all sort of agreed that, like, regardless of where you land on the political spectrum, there's no getting around that for international education, the next 4 years are going to be harder in some capacities. And, you know, just as a point of fact. But that doesn't mean that we have to feel pessimistic about the future or give up on what we're doing in any way. And so this person was essentially asking, you know, if you are in international ed and you tend to be more of an idealist and about the positive impact of international education, how do you balance, you know, your personal values about these topics with approaching you know, decision makers, political leaders who may just honestly just share a very different value than you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, Claire, go ahead.
No, I think it's like such a great question, and it's so important. And I think we all feel these things really deeply. And I mean, if there's something we have in spades here in international education, is like passion and idealism. And so what I always try to think about, though, is really the end goal. And that if the end goal is that I want more people to understand what we do, I want more people to support what we do, I want more students to go abroad, I want more students to have global education, whatever, all of those goals, if those are the end goals of what we want, we will find ways to make it happen. And it's okay if those don't look the same year over year. And it's okay if those have to change. And I would encourage us to kind of not get hung up too much on kind of a certain dogmatic way of thinking about how we need to think about our work or talk about our work. And if in the end we are able to get through to more people and continue to meet some of those end goals, that to me is success.
I totally agree with all of that. And I think it's such a smart question. It's one that we deal with all the time, both personally, I think, as staff who are doing this kind of advocacy work every day, but also with our members or when we have our own advocacy days, that's always a question, especially from newer advocates, as to more or less, if I'm going to see a member of Congress who I totally disagree with their general outlook or policies, how am I supposed to deal with that? And I mean, one is just a frank answer of you have to compartmentalize, and that can be really challenging. And it's something that we have to figure out how to do. And I think for me, I'm always able to do that by noting, really, as Claire said, I do this because I care so deeply about these things. Those are my personal values of pushing forward what we're doing and trying to convince others to get to our cause. So I go into an office, if I disagree personally with that person's policies or values or approach, I have to tell myself, one, okay, that's okay. I'm allowed to disagree with them personally. Two, my goal here is not to try to change the way they think, act, feel, or to influence other issues that are not my issues in going here. And I think that's important because as much as you might want to do that, you can't do that. But then three, to Claire's point, how am I best pushing forward what I believe to be true, what I am here to quote sell, and how do I message that as best I can, and try to get them on board with what I do in some way that resonates with them. That is success there. And it's okay to view that as a successful interaction if you can start to bring someone, even just incrementally, into our fold, even if you haven't changed everything else about them, which again, you can't. You got to be okay with that. You kind of got to compartmentalize that and realize this is my strategy, this is my focus, and this is my goals, and really remain laser focused on that.
But let me just add also, I think I would also encourage us just, don't lose that passion. Don't lose the idealism. I mean, that's what drives us all to come to work every single day. And there will be harder days. And I'd say kind of a shameless plug for associations. This is why we have associations. This is why we have groups of like-minded people who can come together, share knowledge, recharge, kind of learn from each other about how they're tackling challenges. And know that you're not alone in any of this.
Yeah, that's a great way to end. And I think kind of to your point about the openness, open-mindedness. I mean, I think we all have to remember too that that's what we're trying to create is an open world where we're hearing other perspectives. And one of the things I've encouraged everybody, because international ed, our brand is that we're pretty liberal, sort of left-leaning. But that's, I think there's a lot of people in our field that are probably right-leaning or more centrist, and that's great. And I encourage you, if you know someone in the field that maybe isn't vocal because they might be a little nervous about sharing their perspective, ask them. Like, be an open listener about their perspective on these issues and why they think that one strategy is better than another, and really try to listen and hear it. And not, close down because it's just not our talking points. I think that's one of our challenges as a country right now generally, but I think for our field specifically, I think we got to kind of practice the behavior we want to see in our students, and kind of be open to those things. Thank you both so much for being here. I want to encourage everyone, if you haven't already, make sure you register for the AIEA conference coming up in the first week of March. Definitely go to the Alliance on International Exchange website, learn more about what Mark and his team are doing over there. And I just want to say that I should have prefaced this whole conversation with, none of us have the answers. This is not a session to say, here's what you got to do, and we're going to stop this, X, Y, Z. We're all just kind of absorbing this as it comes. And I really appreciate both of you being so open about what's happening in reality, and giving us some hope and encouragement on how we can move forward as a field together. So thank you all so much. Thank you everybody who attended and listened and asked questions. And I'll see you very soon on the next Spotlight.
Okay. And if this is you on like a little less bubbly, I don't know what your normal self is.
I know. Well, when I get nervous, I was telling you before, when I get nervous, I I put on a face. And so, yeah, after this, I'm probably going to go cry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brooke. Really appreciate it.